People don't fall in love with who you are. They fall in love with what they think you are. And that was exactly why Charlotte Winslow decided to disappear. 3 nights before anyone in that grand ballroom whispered her name with awe, she stood in a quiet Manhattan restaurant wearing a simple black apron, her blonde hair tied back, her hands steady, but her eyes watching everything. Because being the sole heiress to a multi-billion-dollar empire meant she had seen too many smiles that came with price tags, too many compliments that sounded like negotiations, and she was done with all of it. So she chose a place where no one would look twice, where a woman carrying plates was just part of the background, where truth, if it existed, would reveal itself without effort. The restaurant hummed with soft jazz and the clink of glass, a place where dinners easily cost over $300 and no one ever asked the waitress her name. And Charlotte preferred it that way, moving from table to table like she didn't belong to a world of private jets and boardrooms, like she was just another girl working a late shift to make rent. If you've ever wondered whether people treat you differently when they think you have nothing, you might understand why she did this, and maybe you'd even have done the same, or maybe not. But Charlotte wasn't interested in maybes anymore. She wanted proof. That was when Ethan Cole walked in, 5'11", tailored navy suit, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention, the kind of man who checked his watch not out of impatience but precision, and when he sat down, he didn't look around to see who noticed him. He simply existed like the room adjusted itself around him. Charlotte noticed that first. Then she noticed something else. He didn't glance at her the way most men did, didn't scan her face, didn't dismiss her either. He just handed her the menu with a quiet thank you, as if she were a person and not part of the furniture, and for a second, just a second, Charlotte felt something shift. She poured his coffee, careful, controlled, but the cup tilted just enough, a thin stream spilling onto his sleeve, dark against expensive fabric. The room seemed to pause, the kind of pause where people expect anger, entitlement, a scene. But Ethan didn't move right away. He looked at the stain, then at her, and what he said next wasn't sharp or dismissive. It was calm, almost curious. Accidents happen. And Charlotte blinked, because that wasn't how this usually went. Not for someone who could probably buy the entire restaurant without noticing the charge. She reached for a napkin, her fingers brushing the table edge. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said softly, but her eyes lifted, just enough to meet his, measuring him the way he unknowingly was being measured. And Ethan just nodded once. No irritation, no performance, just acceptance. And as she stepped back, something unspoken lingered in the space between them. Charlotte had come here to test people, to observe, to confirm what she already believed about men and money and truth. But standing there with a damp sleeve and a quiet stranger who didn't react the way he was supposed to, she felt the first crack in her plan. Because sometimes the test begins long before you realize you're the one being tested. The stain dried faster than the silence between them. But Charlotte did not move on from that moment the way she usually did. Because most people revealed themselves instantly when something went wrong, impatience slipping through polished manners like cracks in glass. But Ethan Cole had not flinched, had not corrected her tone, had not even looked around to see who was watching. And that alone made him different in a way she could not immediately explain. She continued her shift, moving through tables with practiced grace. But her attention kept drifting back to him. Not obvious, never obvious, just a glance here. A pause half a second longer than necessary when refilling water, the kind of observation that felt like instinct rather than intention. Ethan, meanwhile, remained exactly as he had been, focused, contained, occasionally checking his watch, occasionally reviewing something on his phone, but never once snapping his fingers or raising his voice the way other men in suits often did. And when another server accidentally bumped into his chair, he simply adjusted his posture and said it was fine, like control, to him, meant quiet rather than dominance. Charlotte had seen men like him before, or at least she thought she had. Men who performed humility because it benefited them. Men who knew how to appear grounded while calculating every outcome. And that thought settled into her mind like a challenge, because if he was playing a role, she would find the moment it slipped. Near the end of the evening, the restaurant grew softer, conversations lowering, lights dimming just enough to blur edges. And that was when the opportunity presented itself, a situation that was not planned but too perfect to ignore. A customer at a nearby table began complaining loudly about his order, his tone sharp, directed not at the food but at the young server who stood frozen beside him, her hands trembling just enough to give away her inexperience. And Charlotte noticed immediately how people reacted, how some turned away, how others watched with quiet curiosity. And then she looked at Ethan, because that was the test she had not expected to run so soon. He could ignore it. Most did. He could stay in his world of calm distance, untouched by something that did not concern him. But instead, he set down his glass slowly, the movement deliberate, and glanced once toward the scene, not with irritation, not with amusement, but with something closer to recognition, as if he had seen this before and understood it without needing explanation. Charlotte felt her breath catch slightly, not visibly, never visibly, but enough for her to realize this moment mattered more than she had planned. Because whatever he did next would not just tell her who he was, it would tell her whether this entire idea of finding something real had been naive from the start. And as the tension in the room tightened like a string pulled too far, Charlotte stood just close enough to hear, just far enough to remain invisible, waiting, watching, because sometimes the smallest moments carried the heaviest truths, and she was about to find out which kind this would be. Some people reveal their character in comfort. Others reveal it when it costs them something. And Charlotte was beginning to understand the difference. The man's voice across the room grew sharper, not loud enough to cause a scene, but precise enough to humiliate, each word aimed at the young server, as if she were an inconvenience rather than a person, and Charlotte watched the girl's shoulders tighten, her fingers gripping the edge of her order pad like it was the only thing keeping her steady, because Charlotte had been there once, not as a waitress, but as a daughter in rooms where she was expected to listen, smile, and never contradict men who thought power gave them permission to diminish others. She remembered her father's boardroom, the long polished table, the way voices lowered when money was involved but sharpened when control was challenged, and she learned early that respect was rarely given freely. It was measured, negotiated, sometimes withheld just to see who would break first. That was why she built this experiment, why she stepped away from a life where her name opened doors before she even reached for them. Because she wanted to know who people were when there was nothing to gain from her. And now, standing in the quiet space between tables, she realized this was not just about observing anymore. It was about understanding what kind of man Ethan Cole truly was. He did not rush, did not intervene immediately, and for a second Charlotte thought he longer than she should have, her thoughts no longer as controlled as her movements, because this was not fitting into the patterns she understood, not aligning with the behaviors she had learned to anticipate. And for the first time since she put on that apron, she felt something unfamiliar, not certainty, not skepticism, but curiosity layered with something quieter, something more dangerous, because if he was not playing a role, if this was simply who he was when no one was watching, then everything about her test was about to become far more complicated than she ever intended. Respect does not announce itself. It reveals itself in the smallest choices. And Charlotte felt that truth settle deeper than she expected as the evening moved forward. The restaurant returned to its usual rhythm. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked softly, and the moment that had quietly shifted something inside her seemed to disappear for everyone else, but not for her. Because now every detail about Ethan Cole stood out in sharper focus. The way he sat without taking up unnecessary space. The way he listened more than he spoke when the manager briefly approached his table. The way he signed his check without hesitation but without display, as if money was a tool and not a statement. Charlotte approached again to clear his table, her movements precise, her expression neutral, but her thoughts no longer distant, and for the first time she chose not to remain entirely invisible. Was everything satisfactory tonight? She asked, her tone professional, but there was something quieter beneath it, something testing in a different way now, and Ethan looked up at her. Really looked this time, as if noticing the question behind the question, not just the words. Yes, he said simply, then paused, his eyes briefly flicking to the faint stain that still marked his sleeve. And it was not because everything was perfect, and Charlotte felt a subtle tension in that response, not defensive, not critical, but deliberate, like he was offering her something she had not asked for. Directly, she tilted her head slightly, the smallest break from routine. Then why? She asked before she could stop herself, and for a fraction of a second, the world between them felt less like server and customer and more like two people standing on equal ground. Ethan's expression did not change much, but something in his gaze softened, not warmth exactly, but recognition. Because people decide what matters, he said, his voice low, steady. And most of it does not. And then he reached into his jacket, not for a display, not for attention, but to leave payment that was generous without being excessive, precise, like everything else about him. Charlotte watched his hand for a moment longer than necessary, noticing the absence of hesitation, the lack of performance, and it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately define. Because this was not how the pattern was supposed to go. There was no flirtation, no attempt to impress, no subtle indication that he expected anything in return, and yet the space between them felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with status. "Good night," he added, standing, his voice carrying the same calm certainty as before, and Charlotte almost responded with something more than the standard reply, almost stepped outside the role she had carefully constructed. But instead she nodded, "Good night, sir," the words sounding more distant than she intended, because she realized something she had not planned for, something that shifted the ground beneath her entire experiment. She had come here to observe, to test, to confirm what she already believed. But Ethan Cole was not reacting the way men usually did when they thought a woman had nothing. He was not revealing a weakness she could categorize, not offering a flaw she could expose, and for the first time, Charlotte felt the need to go further. Not because she doubted him, but because she was starting to doubt her own assumptions. And as she watched him walk toward the exit, his reflection briefly catching in the glass doors before disappearing into the city night, she made a quiet decision she would not admit out loud. The test was not over, not even close, and next time, she would push harder, because the truth she was looking for was no longer simple, and neither was he. The moment you decide to push someone is the moment you risk losing them. And Charlotte knew that, but knowing had never stopped her before. The next evening, she arrived earlier than usual, her apron tied just a little tighter, her movements sharper, because what she felt now was no longer simple curiosity. It was a need to understand something that refused to fit into the patterns she trusted. And when Ethan Cole walked in again, right on time as if he had never left, she felt it instantly, that quiet shift in her focus. Like the entire room had narrowed down to a single point. He chose the same table, not out of habit but precision, and when she approached, their eyes met for a fraction longer than necessary, long enough to acknowledge recognition without speaking it. "Good evening," she said, steady, controlled, but this time she did not look away. First, and Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "Good evening," he replied, his tone unchanged, but there was awareness there now. The kind that comes after noticing something once and choosing to notice it again. Charlotte placed the menu down, but she did not step back immediately, and that was new, deliberate, the first move in a test she had not fully planned. Because this time she would not wait for the world to present the moment. She would create it. Later, as the evening unfolded, the opportunity came in a different form, subtle, carefully constructed. A man in an expensive suit approached Ethan's table, his voice low but confident, the kind of tone used in negotiations rather than conversations, and Charlotte, passing by with a tray, slowed just enough to catch the words, "An offer, a partnership," something significant enough that most men would shift their attention completely, would forget everything else in the presence of opportunity. She set a glass down. At a nearby table, her back partially turned, but her attention entirely fixed, because this was the moment she had arranged. Not by chance, but by design. The man was not a stranger, not truly. He was someone who knew exactly what to say, exactly how to frame the choice, success or distraction, gain or inconvenience. And at the center of it all, Charlotte, presented indirectly as both. "You are wasting time here," the man said smoothly, glancing briefly in her direction without making it obvious. "There are better investments than this." And the pause was intentional. Just enough to imply, just enough to test. Charlotte felt her pulse steady rather than race, because this was familiar territory. This was the kind of moment she understood, where people revealed their priorities when something more valuable was placed in front of them, and for a second, she prepared herself for the outcome she expected, The polite dismissal, the quiet shift, the subtle distancing that always followed when someone realized she was not worth their time. But Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not lean forward, did not show interest the way most would. Instead, he looked at the man with a calm that bordered on disinterest, as if the offer itself had not earned his attention yet. And then, slowly, he spoke. If something is valuable, it does not need to compete. And Charlotte felt the words land deeper than she anticipated, because they were not directed at her, not openly, but they reached her anyway, cutting through the structure of the test she had built. The man tried again, adjusting his tone, refining the offer, making it more appealing, more difficult to refuse. But Ethan simply shook his head once, a small, final movement. "I am not interested," he said, and just like that, the moment ended. The opportunity closed without hesitation, without calculation. Charlotte turned away before anyone could see the shift in her expression, because something inside her had just changed, not cracked this time, but shifted entirely, because she realized this was no longer about proving that people would choose advantage over authenticity. It was about facing the possibility that someone might not, and that possibility was far more dangerous than any answer she had expected, because if he was not choosing for gain, if he was not reacting the way the test predicted, then she was no longer in control of what this would become. And for the first time since she started this, Charlotte Winslow felt something she had not planned for: uncertainty. The most dangerous moment in any test is when you realize the answer might change you instead of them. And Charlotte felt that truth settle in as the night stretched on, because Ethan Cole was no longer just a subject in her carefully designed experiment. He was becoming something she could not easily categorize, and that made every next move feel heavier than the last. She moved through the restaurant with the same quiet precision, but her mind was no longer detached. Every glance toward his table carried weight. Every small interaction lingered longer than it should have, and when she finally approached again, this time with his order, she noticed something she had missed before, not in his posture or his tone, but in the absence of something. There was no impatience in him, no subtle urgency to move on to the next thing, as if time, for once, was not something he needed to control. "You come here often," she said, the question slipping out softer than intended, and it was not part of the script, not part of any test she had planned. And Ethan looked at her for a moment, not surprised, not guarded, just aware. "Only when I need to think," he replied, and Charlotte felt that answer settle deeper than expected, because it was not impressive, not strategic. It was honest in a way that did not try to be noticed. She set the plate down, her fingers steady, but her thoughts shifting. "And this place helps?" she asked, and for the first time, Ethan allowed the smallest hint of something that could have been a smile. "No," he said, "but it removes everything that gets in the way." And Charlotte did not respond immediately, because she understood exactly what he meant, even if he did not know why she understood it so well. For a moment, the space between them felt different, less like roles being played and more like something real beginning to form. And that was when the complication arrived, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of something she should have anticipated. Her phone vibrated once in the pocket of her apron, a small, controlled interruption, but enough to break the moment. And when she stepped away to check it, her expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened as she read the message, a name she had not expected to see tonight. Her father's assistant, followed by a simple line: "Board members are asking about your absence, and someone may have recognized you." And Charlotte felt the ground shift beneath her in a way she could not ignore, because this was the risk she had calculated but never truly faced until now. The possibility that her world would collide with the one she had built here, that the identity she wore so carefully would begin to crack. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her breath steady, but her thoughts no longer as controlled, because if Ethan found out now, if the truth surfaced before she understood him completely, everything would change, not just the test, but whatever this was becoming. And for the first time, Charlotte was not sure which outcome she feared more: losing the experiment or losing him. She returned to the floor, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but inside, the certainty she had carried from the beginning was gone, replaced by something far more fragile, because now the situation was no longer hers to control entirely. and as she glanced toward Ethan once more, she realized something she had not been prepared to admit. The test was no longer about proving anything. It was about protecting something that might already be real, and if you were watching this unfold, you might think you know what she should do next, whether she should tell the truth or keep the mask on. But in that moment, standing between two worlds that were about to collide, Charlotte did not know either, and that uncertainty was far more dangerous than any answer she had planned for. The truth does not arrive all at once. It leaves traces first, and Charlotte began to see them everywhere once she knew where to look. The message on her phone did not fade from her mind. It settled there, quiet but persistent, like a clock ticking just beneath the surface, and as she moved through the rest of her shift, she became more aware of the details she had ignored before, not just about Ethan, but about how he saw the world around him. When she returned to his table with a simple refill, he was no longer looking at his phone, but at her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that suggested he had been thinking, connecting something that had not fully formed yet, and Charlotte felt it immediately, that subtle shift, the kind that comes before a question is asked. "You are careful," he said, not as an observation about her service, but something more deliberate. And Charlotte paused for a fraction of a second, her hand still on the coffee pot. "That is part of the job," she replied, her tone even, but Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said quietly. "It is not just that." And the air between them tightened, not with tension, but with awareness, because now he was no longer just responding. He was noticing. Charlotte felt a controlled stillness settle over her, the kind she had learned in rooms where every word mattered, because she understood what was happening, not fully, but enough to recognize the direction. And that was when she made a small mistake, not obvious, not dramatic, but enough. As she reached for the bill folder, the edge of her sleeve shifted just slightly, revealing a detail that did not belong. A thin line of fabric, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakably not part of a standard uniform, the kind of material that came from something far more expensive, and Ethan's eyes caught it, not lingering, not questioning out loud, but registering it in a way that told her he had seen it. Charlotte adjusted her sleeve immediately, smooth, controlled, but the moment had already passed, and she knew it, because people like Ethan did not ignore details, they stored them. "You do not seem like someone who needs this job," he added after a moment, his voice still calm, but now carrying a quiet layer of curiosity that had not been there before. And Charlotte felt the weight of that question without it being fully asked, because it was no longer about what she did, it was about who she was. She could have dismissed it, could have deflected the way she had done countless times before, but something held her back, something that made the usual answers feel insufficient. "People do things for reasons you cannot always see," she said instead, and for the first time, Ethan's gaze sharpened just slightly, not suspicion, not yet, but interest. The kind that comes when something does not align with expectations. He nodded once, as if accepting the answer without fully believing it. And that was when Charlotte realized the balance had shifted, just enough to matter, because now he was no longer just part of her test. He was beginning to form his own understanding of her, piece by piece, detail by detail, and that was far more dangerous than anything she had planned. As he stood to leave, he paused for a second longer than usual, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. "Be careful," he said, and Charlotte felt the words land differently than they should have, because they were not about the job, not about the environment. They were about something else, something unspoken, and she could not tell if he was warning her or himself. She watched him walk away, her thoughts no longer aligned with any strategy she had started with, because now there were too many variables she could not control, too many questions without clear answers. And if you were standing in her place, you might start to wonder the same thing she did in that moment, whether he already knew more than he was saying, or whether he was simply closer to the truth than she had ever intended him to be. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a secret is not that it exists, but that someone else is already beginning to see it without being told. The truth rarely asks for permission before revealing itself, and that night, it did not wait for Charlotte to be ready. The restaurant had nearly emptied, the last few tables settling into quiet conversations, the kind that fade into the background, and Charlotte stood near the service station, her mind still caught between the message on her phone and the look in Ethan's eyes when he said, "Be careful," because it had not sounded like a guess. It had sounded like a conclusion, she told herself. It was nothing, that she still had control, that she could end this whenever she chose. But control has a way of slipping the moment you believe you still have it. And she realized that too late, because just as she turned to clear the final table, the front door opened again, not with hesitation, but with purpose. A man stepped inside, older, composed, dressed in a suit that did not try to impress because it did not need to. And Charlotte felt the shift instantly, not in the room, but in herself, because she recognized him before he even spoke, her father's senior advisor, someone who never appeared without reason. Miss Winslow, he said quietly, not loudly enough for the room to hear, but more than enough for Ethan, who had not yet left, to catch the name as he paused near the exit. And in that single moment, everything Charlotte had built began to unravel. She turned sharply, her voice low, controlled. You should not be here. But the man simply offered a slight nod. Respectful but firm. Your father insists, he replied, and there was no room for negotiation in that tone. Only inevitability. Charlotte felt it then, the collision she had tried to avoid. The two worlds she had kept separate now standing in the same room, under the same light, with no space left to hide. She did not need to look to know Ethan had heard it, but she did anyway, just once, and what she saw was not anger, not shock in the way others might react, but something quieter, something far more cutting, recognition, the kind that comes when pieces finally fall into place. He did not move closer, did not interrupt, he simply watched, and Charlotte realized in that instant that the test she had been running was over, not because she chose to end it, but because the truth had stepped in without asking. I can explain, she said, the words coming out softer than she intended, not to the advisor, but to Ethan, and for the first time since this began, her voice carried something real, something unguarded, but Ethan did not respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, as if comparing the person he thought he knew with the one standing in front of him now. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. You already did, he said, and Charlotte felt those words land harder than anything else that had happened that night, because he was not accusing her, he was concluding something about her, something she could not undo with explanation. The advisor remained silent, aware enough to step back, but the damage had already been done, the illusion broken, the distance between them no longer defined by roles, but by truth. And as Ethan turned toward the door again, this time without hesitation, Charlotte understood something she had not allowed herself to consider until now, that finding someone who saw her without the money meant nothing if she had never shown him who she truly was. And as the door closed behind him, the quiet that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, because for the first time, Charlotte Winslow was not wondering what the truth would reveal. She was wondering if it had already cost her the one thing she could not afford to lose. Some truths do not break you in the moment they are revealed. They stay with you long after, reshaping everything you thought you understood, and Charlotte felt that weight settle. In the silence after the door closed behind Ethan, because for the first time in her life, she had not lost something because of her name, but because she hid behind it. The restaurant lights seemed dimmer now, the familiar space suddenly unfamiliar, as if the role she had played could no longer exist in a place where it had been exposed. And when the advisor stepped closer, ready to speak, Charlotte raised a hand slightly, not out of defiance, but because none of that world mattered in this moment. Not the board, not the expectations, not even the empire she was meant to inherit, because all of it had never felt as real as the way Ethan had looked at her just before he left. She untied her apron slowly, the fabric falling from her hands with a softness that contrasted the weight in her chest. And for a moment she stood there, no longer the invisible waitress, not fully the heiress either, just a woman who had finally seen the cost of her own test. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, lights shifting, people continuing their lives without knowing anything had changed. But Charlotte stepped into that night differently than she ever had before, not with certainty, not with control, but with something quieter, something honest. She found him exactly where she should have expected, not far from the restaurant, standing near the edge of the sidewalk as if he had not quite decided whether to leave or stay. And when she approached, there were no roles left between them, No distance created by titles or assumptions, just truth waiting to be spoken. I did not trust anyone, she said, her voice steady but no longer guarded. So I created a way to prove that I was right. And Ethan did not interrupt, did not turn away. He simply listened, the same way he had in every moment that mattered. And Charlotte took a breath she had not realized she was holding. But you were not part of the test anymore, she continued. Not to me. And there it was. The line she had been avoiding. The one that mattered more than any explanation about money or identity. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, not searching for flaws this time, but understanding something deeper, something that had nothing to do with what she had or what she pretended to be. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but clearer. You wanted to see who I was, he said. But you never let me see who you were. And Charlotte felt that truth settle without resistance, because it was not an accusation, it was a reflection. The city noise softened around them. Or maybe it was just that nothing else mattered in that moment. And Charlotte nodded once, accepting what she had done, not trying to justify it, not trying to soften it, because for the first time, she understood that honesty was not something you could test. It was something you had to give. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for just a second before returning to her. And there was no anger left there, only something more difficult, something that required choice. And after a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, placing it gently in her hand. The same coffee receipt from that first night, the one she had nearly thrown away without thinking. You remember this, he said, and Charlotte nodded, her fingers closing around it carefully, because she understood what it meant, not the moment itself, but what it represented, the version of them that had been simple, unguarded, real. Start there, he added, not as a command, not as a condition, but as a possibility. And Charlotte looked at him, really looked this time, without the weight of expectation, without the structure of her test, just seeing him for who he was, and maybe for the first time, allowing herself to be seen in return. Some stories end with answers, with certainty, with clear outcomes that fit neatly into what people expect. But this was not one of them, because what stood between them now was not a conclusion, it was a choice. And as Charlotte held that small piece of paper in her hand, she realized something that no test could have ever taught her, that the truth is not something you uncover in others. It is something you risk showing yourself, and whether or not they would move forward from that moment, whether or not something real could grow from what had nearly been lost, was no longer about wealth or disguise or control. It was about whether she could finally stop testing the world and start trusting it.